I've been warned not to tell this story. There are people who don't want it told, and speaking publicly about it could put a target on my back. Most people already know VRChat has a reputation. If you never played the game, you've probably heard about the ERP, the e-dating, the over-sexualized avatars, and the general degeneracy that's become synonymous with it online. Maybe you've even visited one of VRChat's lap dance clubs yourself, and if you have, chances are you experienced them a lot like I did at first, sitting in the audience, enjoying the music, watching the performances, and leaving without giving too much of a thought as to what was happening behind the scenes. I myself didn't stay a guest for long. From 2023 to 2024, I owned one of these clubs. After it collapsed, I spent much of 2025 trying, and ultimately failing, to launch a second. This is my story. It's a story of what I witnessed behind the scenes, the mistakes I made, the people I met, and the lessons I learned from 2 years immersed in a part of VRChat that very few players experience for themselves. But before we begin, there's a couple things you should know. The events you're about to hear took place many months ago. Because of the trauma surrounding everything that happened, I cut ties with almost everyone involved and no longer have access to most of the messages, screenshots, and Discord servers that once documented these events. As a result, this documentary is primarily based on my first-hand experiences and my best recollection of them, where I discuss conversations, they're reconstructed from memory rather than being quoted verbatim. In places where I felt it was appropriate, I've also generalized or changed names to protect people's privacy or avoid unnecessary attention going forward. Finally, I want to be absolutely clear about one thing. This documentary is not a call to harass, threaten, or retaliate against anyone mentioned in it. Whatever happened between me and them has happened already. I've moved on with my life, and I genuinely hope everyone else has done the same. The purpose of the story isn't getting revenge. It's to document my experience and help others understand what they're walking into before they make the same journey that I did. So I joined VRChat in 2022, and for the first year or so that I played the game, I didn't even know that clubs existed. I knew there was an adult side of the game, obviously. I mean, you don't have to look very hard to realize that thanks to all the highly sexualized avatars and all that. But it was pretty obvious that plenty of people use VRChat for flirting, ERP, and all other kinds of stuff that went far beyond just simply hanging out with friends. I figured, though, that was about the extent of it. VRChat was just a social game, and some people happen to use it for more adult purposes than others. No big deal. Then, one of my friends told me about a club called Misbehavin'.
Still on that one, hey, honey, hit me up for a good time. My shit bonds till it push me out of line. You can't spell my name without the dollar sign. Rainbow money, take whatever, yes, I'm colorblind.
So that friend had become friends with one of the hosts here named Venom Flare. Now, I don't know how they ever met, don't ask me, but she had invited him to come to some of the club's events. And one evening, when they were set to have an event, he asked me if I wanted to come along. I said yes without really knowing what I was getting myself into, partially because I was kind of in a stage in my life where I would follow this friend everywhere, but was also trying to challenge myself kind of out of my comfort zone at that time of my life too, and try to be more social. Looking back, it's strange how much that one invitation ended up changing my life. I walked into something I never even considered could exist in the game. Music echoed through the room while dancers performed on stage and others floated through the audience, choosing guests from around the stage to dance on while the feature performance was happening. The guests themselves rarely moved. Most of us just simply sat around the stage, watched the performance, and waited to see if we might be chosen for the next dance. Every now and then, people would gather around a bar if the club had one, or quietly talk in the corners, but for the most part, the entire experience revolved around just sitting there and letting the show come to you. If you've never been to one of these clubs, it's difficult to explain why they're so captivating at first. For me, a lot of it came down to confidence, or rather, lack thereof it. I've struggled with body image for most of my life, and I'm self-conscious about my height, and among other things, and I've spent years criticizing my own appearance. I've never really been someone who thought of himself as particularly attractive. Obviously, VRChat doesn't magically erase those insecurities, but it does let you step into a different body for a while. And suddenly, I wasn't looking at myself anymore. I saw a tall, ripped, intimidating man that I was controlling. The exact opposite of me in real life, but exactly the kind of person I wished others saw me as. And then there was everyone else. VRChat had some incredibly talented avatar creators, especially when it comes to female avatars. Sometimes, honestly, it feels like they're all trying to outdo each other with seeing who can create the most attractive model with the smallest waist, the most expressive face, the most exaggerated proportions, and of course, the biggest jiggle physics. Whether that's your thing or not, it's hard to deny the work that goes into them. When one of these dancers in these drop-dead gorgeous avatars chose to spend a song dancing on me, it created a really strange disconnect in my head. Logically, I knew there was another person behind that avatar, but emotionally, my brain wasn't processing if the person dancing on me was a 300-pound male construction worker named Keith in real life. All I saw was this beautiful woman. A woman I could never dream of giving attention to someone like me doing exactly that. I remember thinking, this doesn't happen to people who look like me. It felt like one of those experiences that only happen to attractive people, rich people, celebrities, people who lived completely different lives from my own. Yet, here I was, sitting in a virtual nightclub with music blasting while a beautiful woman sensually wiggled her ass in my face. It was exhilarating. It combined two things I'd always loved, music and women, and wrapped them together in a way that felt almost tailor-made for someone like me. For a few minutes, all those insecurities I'd carried around for years just disappeared. Even so, there was one thought that I couldn't shake that first night. I'd never actually been inside a real nightclub before. Everything I knew about them came from movies, television, and stories I'd heard growing up. My image of clubs wasn't shaped by my personal experience. It was shaped by crime films, action movies, and media that almost always portrayed them as places where something darker was happening just beneath the surface. One scene in particular kept replaying in my head from Too Fast, Too Furious. Brian O'Connor and Roman Pierce are brought into the VIP section of a strip club by the film's main villain. Out on the club floor, the music is playing, people are partying, and everything looks glamorous and totally normal. But behind a closed door, though, a police officer is being tortured with a rat in a hot bucket, while the rest of the club just carries on, as if nothing is happening. Obviously, I didn't think that anyone was literally being tortured inside of Misbehavin', or maybe there was, I don't know, but every depiction of clubs I'd ever seen seemed to carry the same message. They were places of excess, where desperate women sold fantasies to make ends meet. Places where powerful people in organized crime conducted business far away from the public eye. Whether those portrayals are exaggerated or not, they were all I had to compare this experience to. As I sat there, watching the show unfold, I remember wondering if there was an entire world behind the scenes that guests never saw. I couldn't explain why I felt that way. Nothing had happened to make me suspicious. Everyone around me seemed like they were having a pretty great time, and so was I. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something beneath the surface. Not necessarily criminal, but just darker than what I was seeing from my seat. Eventually, I pushed the thought out of my mind. If you'd asked me after I took the headset off that night what I thought of VRChat clubs, I probably would have told you that they were the coolest things I discovered in the game. I had no idea that over the next 2 years, I would eventually find out what was happening behind the scenes. And I certainly never imagined I'd become one of the people helping run them. After that first night, I kept going back most weeks. At first, it was because I genuinely enjoyed myself. The music was great, the atmosphere was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, and every event felt like an escape from real life. Before long, I started recognizing regular dancers and getting to know some of the staff. It didn't take too long before the club stopped feeling like some strange hidden corner of VRChat and started feeling like somewhere I belonged. Over time, I started learning not just the etiquette, but also the unspoken rules of clubbing in VRChat. Outside of clubs, I usually preferred using female avatars. They were expressive, stylish, and honestly just more fun to wear. Inside clubs, though, I figured something out pretty quickly. That the avatar you wore mattered. My very first dance at Misbehavin' wasn't a hot girl. It was actually a guy. I didn't really want the dance, but I was too shy to say no. But I didn't realize that my female avatar attracted mostly male attention. That's not to say I got no female dances. I mean, there were other dancers that danced on females as well. But women were far less likely to approach me if I wore a female avatar. From then on, I primarily used a male avi in clubs when I was a guest. Mostly this one. There were also people who showed up to club events wearing joke avatars, memes, funny characters, but they typically weren't getting much attention from the dancers. But if you showed up looking like the stereotypical tall, muscular, confident guy, or a busty cute girl in skimpy clothes, your chances of getting a dance drastically changed. Looking back, I think that's one of the first lessons the club scene quietly teaches you. You learn what gets attention and what gets noticed. Regardless, when I got attention from dancers, I felt better after a night at the club than I had after almost anything else. The more I thought about it, the more I started looking around at everyone sitting beside me. Most of us probably weren't walking into really exclusive nightclubs every weekend in real life. I'd imagine most of us had our own reasons for getting on VR and escaping into this game we know as VRChat. I wondered if they were feeling the same thing I was, or if I was just projecting my own experience onto them. Either way, I genuinely believed that I'd stumbled onto something special. I'd spent years trying to find something that could quiet the voice in my head that constantly reminded me of everything I didn't like about myself. Nothing had ever worked as quickly as sitting in one of these clubs for a couple hours. Clubs made those insecurities just disappear long enough for me to remember what it was like to be happy. I began to wonder, if this helped me so much, how many other lonely people could it help too? This was the moment I started thinking I wanted to become a part of them. I didn't want status or popularity. I certainly wasn't thinking about power. I honestly believed I'd found something that made lonely people feel a little less lonely. And I wanted to help create that feeling for someone else. It wasn't long before I decided I wanted to work in one of these clubs myself. Ironically, the opportunity came because of something that really should have been my first warning. Venom Flare ended up leaving Misbehavin' after another staff member allegedly tried to pursue her boyfriend. Rather than stay, she and her boyfriend split off and started a new club of their own called Fallen from Grace. Looking back, that probably should have made me stop and think. At the time, though, I just saw it as an isolated incident of interpersonal drama. I became a regular there, so when applications opened, I decided to apply as a DJ. There are a few reasons why I picked DJ instead of becoming a dancer or a host. Firstly, I was still incredibly socially anxious. The idea of hosting in front of a crowd sounded terrifying, and dancing was never really something that I was interested in. Secondly, I loved music, so DJing seemed like the perfect middle ground. I thought it would be so exciting and fun to become the person responsible for setting the mood every week. I imagined playing songs people had never heard before and getting everyone hyped for the night ahead. Reality, though, was a little different. I technically got hired, but I never actually worked an event there. Almost immediately, I found myself butting heads with the head DJ. Looking back, I think it came down to a lot of me just simply not understanding the culture yet. There was an entire set of unwritten rules and expectations that everyone else just seemed to know instinctively, while I was still trying to figure out how everything worked. Instead of feeling like a new employee being shown the ropes, I often felt like I was expected to already know them. But before long, another opportunity presented itself. One of the dancers I'd gotten to know, Hell's Angel, had become one of my favorite people in the club scene. She often picked me as one of her favorite laps whenever she was dancing, and eventually she suggested I apply to another club she also worked at, called Club Mansion. I took the suggestion and landed a DJ gig there. Club Mansion became the place where I really learned what working behind the scenes actually looked like. When I first became a DJ, I thought I'd spend most of my night sharing music I loved with dozens of people. In reality, I only got to do that before the event officially started. During the pre-show, guests would slowly begin filling the venue while I played my own playlists and tried to build excitement before the performances began. I genuinely enjoyed that part. Even though nobody ever came up to me afterward and said, "Hey, great playlist," or asked what songs I was playing, I liked believing I was helping set the mood for the night. Once the show started, though, my job changed completely. Every dancer had already chosen the songs they wanted to perform to, and before each event, I had to organize all of these tracks, making sure everything was in the correct order, and then spend the rest of the evening just triggering them at the exact right moment. If everything went smoothly, nobody noticed I existed. If it didn't, well, everyone noticed. There was also something surprisingly lonely about being a club DJ. Because the booth microphone was broadcast throughout the venue, I couldn't casually talk with people during the event. If I spoke, everyone would hear it. So most of the night, I simply just stood inside the booth while everyone else laughed, flirted, danced, and socialized around me. Some dancers didn't even need me. They started self-playing their own music directly through their mics using similar tools to what I was using. Whenever that happened, I'd spend entire songs just standing here with absolutely nothing to do except watch in my own little isolated pod. I joined the club scene partly because my friends wanted me to get out of my shell and socialize more, but instead I had accidentally chosen one of the least social jobs in the entire club. There was one moment that really stuck with me. Club Mansion eventually upgraded from this world to have a major map overhaul with an entirely new world. I noticed that every department had posters around the venue featuring the staff, as was, common for clubs to do. The dancers were there, the hosts were there, security, photographers, all that jazz, as well as the owner, of course. The DJs, though, were noticeably absent. Instead, they were just empty placeholders where our posters were supposed to be eventually added later. I remember asking the owner at the time several times about them over the following months, and eventually they were added, but by then I'd kind of already accepted that DJs simply just weren't the face of the club. I don't think anyone intentionally excluded us. I mean, guests don't come to clubs because they want to watch somebody click play on Spotify, right? They come for the dancers. And the dream I had to be an appreciated participant in the magic of clubs quickly faded. And honestly, with some of the dances that I witnessed, it was easy to see why. Some of them completely changed how I looked at VRChat. Most dancers can shake their ass to a beat, but the best ones knew how to tell a story with stage dances. They used avatar technology in ways I had never imagined. Entire environments appearing around them. Costumes would transform mid-performance. Animations, props, particle effects, and synchronized movements with clones of their avatar all combined into something that felt more like live theater than dancing. Watching those performances really made me realize something. VRChat clubs don't have to imitate real nightclubs. They could become something entirely their own. At the time, I didn't realize it, but that was probably the first moment I started thinking less like an employee of Club Mansion and more like a creator. The longer I stayed in the club scene, the less interested I became in the generic formula of many clubs. After a while, they all just started to blur together. Every club had a different name and logo. Some leaned into luxury, some leaned into some darker aesthetics, while others simply just wanted to be as sexually charged as possible. Regardless, the branding was generally trying to imitate real life. There were numerous clubs in real life that looked and sounded exactly like those in VRChat. But as I DJ'd for these generic clubs like Mansion and Club Lunar, I just couldn't stop thinking about how much more VRChat was capable of. A lot of these clubs did a pretty good job at recreating what was available in real life, but I was also starting to realize that the platform didn't have to really imitate reality at all. I started to wonder why so many clubs were treated like sets instead of experiences. Very few of them felt like they were places that actually had an identity beyond being somewhere where sexy people danced. The more I thought about it, the more ideas I started to write down. What if the building itself was part of the experience? What if guests weren't just walking into another nightclub, but stepping into another universe? What if there were hidden details that rewarded exploration? What if people left remembering the world just as much as they remembered the dancers? These questions started filling my head every time I DJ'd. I just hadn't realized that I was about to spend the next year trying to realize the answers to those questions. I don't think there was ever one big moment where I decided I was going to start my own club. It was more like an idea that slowly took over my brain. The more events I worked, the more I found myself thinking about what I would do differently. I started wondering why nobody seemed interested in building a club that embraced the possibilities of VRChat instead of just trying to imitate real life. Around that time, my friend Nord started planting an idea in my head. He basically told me, why don't you just make your own club? So, we started brainstorming. In the beginning, it wasn't some massive project. It was just a handful of friends throwing ideas back and forth. Nord, Perry, Soldier, and I would spend hours talking about what this imaginary club could be if we weren't limited by what everyone else was already doing. The name came first, Hellbound. Originally, the concept really was just that, a strip club in hell. But the more we talked, the weirder the idea became. Eventually, hell disappeared almost entirely as a concept, replaced by something I thought was much more interesting. Instead of taking place in the underworld, Hellbound would be set aboard a spaceship sometime in humanity's future. According to the lore we were writing, the ship had originally been built as a missionary vessel, traveling from world to world to spread Christianity among the stars. During one of these journeys, the crew answered a distress signal from an abandoned ship drifting through space. That decision doomed everyone on board. Hidden inside the abandoned vessel was a parasitic alien life form. Instead of simply killing its victims, it corrupted them. The missionaries slowly abandoned everything they once believed, turning the ship into an interstellar strip club devoted to temptation rather than salvation, as the parasite attempted to get to its home planet of hell. Those who resisted the corruption didn't survive. The dancers weren't just dancers anymore. They were part of the story. The guests weren't simply entering another nightclub to drink and have fun. They were boarding an infected spaceship. At least, that was the dream. I wanted people to discover pieces of that story naturally, with hidden props, environmental details, animations, Easter eggs, maybe even some cinematic videos later on. My hope was that someone would come for the dances, but leave talking about the world itself. Looking back, I think that's what excited me the most, the technical side of the project. I spent months teaching myself how worlds differed from avatars as far as Unity was concerned. I modified the template we'd started with, replaced textures, redesigned rooms, created signage, built props, made posters, and just tried to turn the generic club template into something that truly felt like Hellbound. It was easily the most ambitious creative project I had ever attempted. Despite being the owner, though, I wasn't the one who made people show up. If you removed me from the social side of the equation after the world was built, I honestly think the club probably would have kept running. I brought the vision, but the people around me brought the community. In those early days, Hell's Angel was instrumental in helping recruit a lot of staff and spread the word. Venom Flare also played a major role in getting the project off the ground before our relationship eventually fell apart. As time went on, other people, such as Neko Snowlily and Clowns VR, would become just as important to the club's growth. I wasn't the charismatic leader shaking hands with everyone who walked through the door. That just simply wasn't me. Not everyone thought the project would succeed. Other club owners were polite enough, and some genuinely offered advice, but I always got the feeling that they saw me as the overly ambitious newcomer with an idea and not much else. Nobody ever came out and said I was wasting my time, but there was definitely a feeling of, go get 'em, buckaroo. It was demeaning, but they weren't entirely wrong. One of the biggest pieces of wisdom I got from massively popular club owners who did take the time to sit with me and mentor me was that they were basically up and running within a month or two of deciding to start a club because they had a huge friend group to guarantee attendance and staff participation. Any third party that found out about the club and joined later was just a bonus. I didn't have that. I had a small handful of friends, most of whom weren't popular or interested in the club scene, and I relied on the connections in the early days, mostly of just Hell's Angel and Venom Flare. However, against the odds, we launched. And somehow, people came. Not just friends, but complete strangers. Week after week, we'd see new faces sitting around the stage waiting for the show to begin. Staff started taking pride in being a part of Hellbound. Guests complimented the atmosphere. Even other club owners acknowledged that we'd managed to build something surprisingly successful without having to rely on an enormous pre-existing social circle. I don't think I'll ever forget those first few months. However, owning a club wasn't glamorous. I very quickly found out what being an owner actually meant, and that was being the sole lightning rod for every single problem under the sun with the club. During events, I was constantly being pulled in different directions. Someone needed the lineup fixed, security had a problem to deal with, a staff member had a question, a guest wanted to tell me how much they were enjoying themselves. There was always something demanding my attention, sometimes so much I would get dizzy from 3 people trying to talk to me at once. Most nights, I barely had time to actually enjoy the club I'd spent months creating. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of someone experiencing Hellbound for their first time in a VRChat club. You could almost see it on their face. They would get picked for a dance and walk back to their seat afterward giggling, all flustered as their friends teased them, and spend the rest of the night looking like they just couldn't believe what had happened. Every time I saw that, I thought back to my own first night at Misbehavin'. In those moments, all the stress was worth it. I honestly believed we were giving people the same feeling that had once helped pull me out of some of my darkest thoughts. Back then, that was enough. When I first imagined owning a club, I pictured myself standing back and watching people enjoy something I'd helped create. In reality, I don't think I ever got to experience Hellbound the way our guests did. By the time the club was running regularly, I rarely sat down to actually watch the performances. Even when I tried, I'd usually notice something that needed my attention before the first song was over. There was always something. I used to joke that I felt like I'd traveled back in time to captain the Titanic. Nothing catastrophic was happening most nights, but I spent the entire event walking around looking for icebergs anyway. It was probably my anxiety and or my ADHD's fault, but whatever the reason, I found it almost impossible to relax. As a guest, I'd spent entire nights getting lost in the atmosphere, but as an owner, I was constantly scanning for problems before anyone else noticed them. The funny thing is, compared to a lot of other owners, I probably wasn't even doing that much. Most of the actual social work that kept Hellbound alive wasn't done by me, it was done by the people around me. Most of the people who came to Hellbound knew someone on the team or knew someone who did. I honestly don't think our advertising brought many people through the door. Like most clubs, attendance spread through personal connections far more than public promotion. I think that's one of the reasons why I always felt a little different from other owners. I wasn't naturally charismatic, I wasn't able to sit menacingly in the corner like a lion overlooking his pride like I've seen other club owners do. And networking didn't come naturally to me. If Hellbound succeeded, it wasn't because I could just walk into a room and instantly make 20 new friends. It succeeded because people around me believed in the idea enough to help carry it. Sure, I maintained the world, but most owners outsource that to an actual world creator and spend most of their time actually running operations of the club. And every week there seemed to be another reminder that I wasn't the outgoing leader doing things that a club owner ought to be. A good owner leads with trust, initiative, and conviction in what they've created. I don't think I did any of that correctly, mostly due to my social anxiety. This became the most evident when it came to recruiting new staff. Recruiting had never been my strength, and people naturally came and went over time. There were events where we had to ask other clubs for emergency dancers just to fill out the schedule. I remember one collaboration where Hellbound only had 2 dancers performing while the other club brought 6. Nearly every event there was some fire in the event organization to be put out as well. Some nights we'd have dancers simply not show up after signing up for an event. Sometimes dancers would change songs after the schedule had already been finalized, or they decided at the last minute they wanted to dance on someone different, which meant the entire schedule suddenly had to shift around one person's availability. If the guest they wanted happened to be AFK when their dance came up, we were scrambling backstage trying to figure out what to do next without disrupting the show. Other nights, I'd make last-minute changes to the world in Unity, barely have time to upload them before opening, and then scramble around after doors should have already opened trying to fix something that broke. From the audience, I'm sure everything, for the most part, looked like it was running smoothly. Behind the scenes, it often felt like chaos, and like the whole club was going to completely crash and burn at any moment, which made the relief of getting through another event feel like I had just returned from a war. And no matter how carefully we planned, something always changed. Something always broke. Someone was always running late. Someone always needed help. As a guest, I assumed clubs just kinda happened. As an owner, I realized they only happened because dozens of people were constantly adapting to whatever went wrong next. Despite being pulled in a million directions at once every night by everyone, when the event would end, everyone would just leave. Once the event instance closed, things got strangely quiet. Maybe I was just not cared about or respected, but whatever the reason, it became obvious that most of the relationships I had with my staff revolved around just keeping Hellbound running, and nothing more. The club had become the thing that connected us. Without it, there wasn't always much left to fall back on in terms of a friendship. As the months went on, I also started paying more attention to other owners. When I was just a guest, I always looked up to them. They seemed confident, respected, almost larger than life. Owning my own club changed that perspective. Some owners were genuinely kind people trying their best, while others seemed to enjoy the title a little too much. There was one owner of another club, which I won't mention here, but she ran her club with the kind of strictness you'd expect from the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, even though almost everyone involved was volunteering their time. Outside of events, I'd see owners casually mention the clubs they ran almost like it was a part of their identity. Status and ego mattered more than I had realized. At first, none of that really bothered me. I was too busy trying to keep Hellbound alive. Plus, I thought there was more room in the scene for people with other motivations beyond just clout. Somewhere along the way, though, I noticed something had changed. When I started building the club, I wanted to create unforgettable experiences. Now, I spend most of my time making sure we just survived another event. The vision hadn't disappeared, but it had been just buried beneath responsibility. And without realizing it, I had stopped asking myself whether I was still having fun. I was too busy making sure everyone else in the club was. Like most clubs, we were almost always looking for dancers. We weren't especially picky either. If someone genuinely wanted to learn and seemed willing to put an effort into their performances, we usually gave them a chance. Looking back, that's something I'm still proud of. One of the dancers we hired early on was Jade Everbloom. Hellbound was the first club willing to give her an opportunity, and from there she went on to dance for dozens of clubs across the community. Watching someone grow like that was one of the most rewarding parts of the club, and to this day I'm still very proud of what she has achieved in the scene. I feel honored to have given her that big break. I didn't expect everyone who came through our club to have that kind of success story thanks to us, but I had envisioned Hellbound to be something separate from the rest of the club scene. I knew there was drama between clubs. I had heard stories, seen people leave one place and show up somewhere else. I knew friend groups splintered and people bounced between communities. But I guess I believed that Hellbound was supposed to be in its own little world, above all that petty drama. It didn't take very long for reality to prove me wrong. Our first real taste of being forced to play by the club scene's twisted rules came a few months into our run, when a newly recruited male dancer came to us with a warning before he'd ever worked his first event. He told us he had an ex-girlfriend named Temptress, who had been following him from club to club after their relationship ended. According to him, every time he found a new place to dance, she'd eventually appear and accuse him of being a pedophile in an attempt to get him fired. It was an incredibly serious accusation, but not one uncommon to VRChat. At the same time, we had nothing to go on except what he'd told us. We hadn't received complaints from anyone else about his conduct, and nobody had contacted us independently. As far as we knew, this was simply a messy breakup that had spilled over into the club scene, so we took him at his word. A few days later, Temptress showed up. One of our security leads called me down to the lobby because she wanted to speak with us. Looking back, I remember feeling relieved that almost nobody was around. There may have been one guest sitting nearby, but I'm pretty sure they were AFK, so they weren't listening. Whatever this conversation was going to become, at least it wasn't unfolding in front of a packed lobby at club opening. The security lead handled most of the conversation, and the request he made was simple. If she was going to accuse one of our staff members of something that serious, we needed evidence. She was given about half an hour to provide it, and she couldn't. It might not have been the most popular decision if word got out to other club owners, but without anything to substantiate the accusation, we made the decision to remove her from the world and blacklist her from Hellbound, siding with our dancer. At the time, I believe we'd made the right call. Months later, after he'd already left our club, that same dancer did enter into a questionable relationship with a minor. According to him, they never crossed the line into anything sexual, but I'm sure most clubs wouldn't be okay with that. Around that same time, I also came to know Temptress personally and experienced firsthand the manipulative behavior he'd warned us about. The truth wasn't nearly as simple as either of them had presented it. Neither of them fit cleanly into the role of victim or villain. That was around the time I noticed something that, in hindsight, seems obvious. There's no such thing as playing by your own rules in the club scene. You can be the most innocent, sweet gumdrop princess in the world and think your club will be too, but you can't succeed in the culture without amalgamating into it. I hadn't signed up for that. When I started Hellbound, I wanted to build a place where lonely people could forget about the things weighing them down for a few hours. Instead, I found myself trying to sort through personal problems and drama. It was frustrating, but more than that, it was disappointing. I kept thinking back to my first night at Misbehavin'. I remembered sitting there as a guest, wondering if there was some hidden world behind the scenes that ordinary people never saw. No, there weren't people being actually tortured in the back, but what I eventually found was something equally uncomfortable and ugly. People outside of VRChat tend to imagine clubs as giant ERP orgies where everyone is sleeping with everyone else. Are there clubs that blur that line? Absolutely. Some clubs openly cater to private ERP or offer experiences that go well beyond dancing. Those places exist, and even when I was deeply involved in the club scene, they always made me a bit uncomfortable. But they weren't representative of the clubs I spent my time in. Most clubs actually had surprisingly strict boundaries when it came to respecting their dancers. If a dancer didn't want to be touched and you ignored that, security would remove you from the instance almost immediately. Most clubs took that kind of behavior very seriously because the dancers were volunteers. If they stopped feeling safe, the club stopped functioning. In that sense, the average VRChat club was probably more respectful of performers than many people would expect. It wasn't what happened on stage that was the problem. It was everything surrounding it. When you first walk into a club, it seems pretty simple. Guests are there to enjoy the performances, staff are there because they enjoy dancing, music, or entertaining people. For many people, that's exactly where the story ends. But if you spend enough time around these communities, you start noticing another layer underneath all of it. Clout rules. The dancers who became the biggest names weren't always the ones who were the most technically skilled. Some absolutely were, but the people who built the largest followings were often the ones who know how to flirt and make a guest feel special. Before long, you started noticing the same pattern over and over again. Guests weren't just coming back because they enjoyed the performances, they were hoping to build some kind of relationship with the dancers themselves. Hell, sometimes even the security would have their own simps, who hung around the lobby instead of getting dances. Most dancers would shut these poor men and women down when it became clear they were catching feelings, but others would string them along, getting their hopes up. I know Hell's Angel was incredibly flirty with me during the creation of Hellbound. She would talk about how abusive her boyfriend was and how sweet and supportive I was of her. She really made me think that I had a shot, until one day she just ghosted everyone and disappeared. In hindsight, I'll say that I'm not mad or disappointed. That relationship probably wouldn't have worked out anyways, and I don't think I'd choose her if she came back today. Even when you weren't the guest in question, you would often feel that hope lingering beneath the surface amongst many guys in the crowd. It was rarely spoken aloud. It didn't really have to be. It's worth noting that not every dancer encouraged that attention in the same way. Some kept very clear boundaries while others leaned into it. Many dancers accepted tips or donations through Cash App or PayPal, via links prominently displayed in their profiles. Other dancers simply enjoyed the admiration that came with being one of the community's biggest names and started their own fan clubs. Again, none of this was true of everyone. Some clubs were managed better than others, some had healthier cultures than others, and there were plenty of dancers who just simply loved performing and wanted nothing more than to put on a good show. But the longer I stayed in the scene, the more I realized that the clubs weren't just rewarding great performances. They were rewarding attention. And attention has a way of changing people. The longer I spent in VRChat, the more I realized the club scene wasn't some isolated bubble. It was really just a magnifying glass pointed at the rest of the game. When people think about VRChat clubs, they usually jump straight to the sexual side of things, which is understandable. Lap dances are the first thing people see, and they're the easiest thing to criticize. But I don't think the sexual content was the biggest problem. The biggest problem was the people. VRChat attracts a lot of people who struggle socially. That's one of the reasons I was on the game, after all. Being able to meet people without leaving the house is an amazing thing, especially if you've always found making friends to be difficult. The downside is that VRChat also attracts people who are still trying to figure themselves out. Most of the club staff that I met fell somewhere between 18 and their mid-20s. That's an age where people are still learning who they are, how relationships work, and how to deal with conflict. Most of us were still immature in one way or another, and I know I certainly was, even being in my 30s. But there's something special about the specific age range of players involved in the club scene. Not only are they still trying to figure out who they are, but VRChat is a perfect test chamber for people to experiment with how bad of a person they can be and get away with it. The body language is harder to read than in real life, leaving just tone of voice to judge someone's true intentions, and that can often be fake too. We can't just blame it all on age, though. It was also specifically the kind of people that the club scene attracted. On one hand, I've met dancers who were finally able to present as the gender they'd always wanted to be since they couldn't do that safely at home, which is great. But I've also met a lot of people who grew up in abusive households, people who had been sexually assaulted, people who came from families caught up in drug addiction or violent crime. For a lot of them, VRChat clubs weren't just somewhere to have fun for a few hours. It was somewhere they could escape. I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. Honestly, it's one of the things I still love most about VRChat, but escaping your life isn't the same thing as healing from it. Whatever someone is carrying with them doesn't disappear when they put on the headset. It follows them into every friendship, every relationship, every argument, and every community they become a part of. After working with enough clubs, I realized that I wasn't alone in my struggles with Hellbound. Almost every club had something going on, whether it be poor management or relationship drama spilling over into the workplace, whatever. As a guest, you never see any of that. You walk into a world, sit around the stage, enjoy the dances, and take off the headset at the end of the event thinking everyone had a great night. No owner wants guests thinking that their event is falling apart. You solve the problem, smile, and keep the night moving. And honestly, most of the bigger conflicts didn't even happen during events. People generally wanted the shows to succeed, and even if two staff members couldn't stand each other, they'd usually keep it together, at least until the last guest left the instance. The real arguments happened afterward. People would sit in private worlds, shit-talking other members for hours. Discord calls would turn into gossip sessions. Somebody would vent about another staff member who would then hear about it from someone else, and before long, the entire club knew. Sometimes the drama came from inside the club, but other times somebody from another club showed up, carrying old baggage with them. When Hellbound launched, I thought I was building something new. In reality, I was building it with people who already had histories, friendships, rivalries, exes, and reputations that stretch across half the club scene. I don't think there's a single owner who escapes that. Some of the most popular dancers were loyal to relationships they built, either friendships with other staff or parasocial relationships with guests. When those dancers moved to another club, a lot of their favorite guests followed. When friendships fell apart or someone left on bad terms, entire groups sometimes drifted with them. I've seen entire clubs fall apart because of that. Romantic relationships inside the staff, however, added a whole other layer. I remember seeing performers trying to balance their relationship with the expectations of the job. I've seen at least a small handful of dancers in my time be pressured by their partners to toe this really awkward thin line between a lap dance and a stage dance, where they were allowed to dance near a guest, but not on a guest. Another might be fine with dancing as long as certain boundaries are respected, such as no stripping and no touching. Every couple had to figure that out for themselves. I think one of the biggest miscalculations by me as an owner was how attractive that title was to people. Not the person who was the owner, me, but the title itself and the power behind it. During my time as an owner, I had at least 2 different dancers express some sort of crush on me. Clowns VR was the first to privately admit it to me, and I only found out later through a mutual friend that a dancer that I liked, Kenzie the Goddess, was crushing on me too. However, nowadays, I raise my eyebrow and question the validity of this. Clowns was able to string me along for several months after I was single, using my knowledge of their confession and my mutual feelings to seize a lot of control over the club I attempted to launch after Hellbound, called the Succubus Sanctum. Eventually, I found out they were chasing other guys while leading me to believe we were still on track to date. To be fair, we never did, so I guess they're fully in their right to explore their options, but boy, did it suck feeling like I had a shot with them when I never really did. I never talked to Kenzie about her feelings for me before we lost contact, but after what happened with Clowns, I have my doubts about it being genuine. If it was, I'll gladly eat my words, but we don't talk anymore, so I'm not holding my breath. Another reason I abandoned the idea of ever being with Kenzie was because long before I ever found out about their crush on me, they ended up dating my head of security. It was serious for a long time, but even from my vantage point, I could tell that he was incredibly protective of her. Overly so. I don't want to get too deep into it here, as this really belongs in a later section, but it wouldn't be uncommon to see him trying to intimidate people who came off as overly friendly to her, or outright threaten people who made her upset. He was a pretty scary guy when he wanted to be. There were other dancers that did manage to pull me into a relationship, starting with Neko Snow Lily. She started out as a guest at Hellbound as a friend of our head of security. She and I met after she won an avatar giveaway that we had at one event, and from there, we got into a relationship, and in my love bomb state, I quickly raised her up through the ranks at Hellbound to be one of the top individuals involved. I don't know if she ever knowingly took advantage of my loneliness, but she certainly benefited from it. She gave me all the attention I could handle, and then some, causing me to slowly drift away from my friends. When she danced for her primary club, Club Zodiac, she would constantly pick me as her preferred lap and got in trouble with club management several times for not dancing on other people as much as she should be. My own club grew resentful of our relationship as well, as other higher-ups had a hard time running the club without my help when I would have to take her into my isolated office in the middle of an event and spend the next half an hour to an hour calming her down from a panic attack or a depressive episode. She made me put my duties as her boyfriend above everything else in my life. Ultimately, it all fell apart. During a pretty disastrous Valentine's Day trip to Salem, Massachusetts, she pressured me into trying to impregnate her, despite me telling her I wasn't ready for that. When I panicked afterwards after realizing what I had just done, begging her to at least consider Plan B, she got mad and stormed off into the night. She ended up not being pregnant, and I later found out it wasn't even for her. She was feeling pressured by her parents to give them a grandchild since they were both in poor health and wanted to live to see a grandchild. She used me as a pawn for her parents' scheme. Shortly after this, and with a small intervention that pulled in all my immediate family and friends, I broke up with her. However, it wouldn't be the last time I got entangled with another problematic person. I hated Temptress for a long time. After all, she was the one who brought the first serious allegation to my doorstep and made my job harder because of it. But somehow, and I don't even remember how, we got in touch and started growing closer. She was cute, and once that dancer she previously accused was caught engaging with minors, she became vindicated in my eyes. I thought maybe her ex had lied about how crazy and manipulative she was. Before long, we started dating. There were red flags, but like most of my relationships, I brushed them off and enjoyed having a sweet girlfriend who treated me way better than Neko did. We'll come back to Temptress later on, but for this section, I wanted to cover some of the things that happened in our relationship that eventually proved to me that the dancer was just as right about her as she was about him. Firstly, early into our relationship, she asked me to install a piece of software onto my PC that gave her remote access to my system, as well as download Life 360 and join her family on there that consisted of her closest friends, and let her track any of us across the world. I wasn't very comfortable with either of these things, but I did it to appease her. Secondly, there was a period of time where she was being dragged through the mud in the club scene and couldn't be seen being around me, so she claimed, and that she would have one of her friends pretend to be her boyfriend publicly while she was still secretly with me. When she eventually ghosted me one day, I was heartbroken and reached out to that friend who was playing her boyfriend and thanked him for his kindness and cooperation to partake in the scheme before I disappeared into my corner to be sad. He was confused and angry. He told me that he was her actual boyfriend, at least to his knowledge. Well, turns out, not only was she cheating on the both of us with each other, but there is actually a third guy in the mix that I never found out much about, but who was her actual boyfriend, with me and her friend just being her side toys, I guess. Her friend and I apologized to each other after we found this out, and we left things on better terms. However, I don't even think the cheating was the worst of it. The worst of it was how she slammed the death nail into the coffin of Hellbound itself. At the time, Hellbound wasn't doing too good. We were hemorrhaging staff, people were unhappy with some of my decisions, and I felt like the club was already on life support at this time. It's then that Temptress told me that my dance captain, Izumi Sakura, and my head of security were planning a coup to overthrow me, remove me as the owner of Hellbound, and run the club themselves. She said that I should give the ownership of the club's Discord server and group over to her for safekeeping so that they couldn't take it from me. I did give it to her for a short while, and when Izumi and my head of security approached me about the whole thing, I found out that Temptress had lied. Yes, they weren't happy with how I was running things, but there was no coup. They didn't want ownership or control of Hellbound. All they wanted to do was have a talk with me and to suggest that I step down to take care of my mental health. The fact that I had trusted Temptress's word instead of talking to them permanently scarred my relationship with the both of them and effectively killed Hellbound entirely. I lost friends to drama as well, drama that didn't even involve me. At Hellbound, one of our first regulars was this Norwegian guy. He loved the club and would show up all the time. He and I became friends and would end up running into each other at other clubs too, where he was a welcome part of our friend group that attended as guests. He really wanted to see Hellbound succeed. However, one day, there was an investigation launched into him by one of the blacklists for comments he made about fantasies involving non-consensual sex. In my personal opinion, I don't think he ever meant to do anything like that. He was clearly autistic and probably failed to see how admitting something like that would raise alarms. But he never struck me as a creepy or dangerous guy. He was always respectful of the dancers when we hung out with him, and even when he was interviewed for evidence, he genuinely seemed like he had no idea why people were upset over what he said. I wanted to remain friends with him because, like I said, he was generally a fun, chill guy I got along with well. He didn't seem like he would hurt a fly. However, the blacklist came down hard on me for not just going along with their decision to immediately blacklist him for being a threat, and they threatened to never work with us again and blacklist Hellbound if we didn't comply with their decision. So ultimately, I cut him out of my life. In the months that followed, I observed from a distance and watched him spiral into a deep, severe depression as the blacklist affected his ability to attend any clubs. I felt so bad for him. Eventually, he left VRChat entirely. I don't know what he's up to now or if he's even still alive. While most events were run without drama, there was one incident where drama happened directly backstage at an event. I remember we were doing a collab event with Club Royals when I got called backstage to deal with the situation. I get there to find one of my dancers, Luna Butterfly, on the tail end of a screaming tirade against another dancer of ours, Nessie the Nerd, and our dance captain, Izumi. She then promptly quit the club right then and there, leaving the event. I was later informed what happened. Nessie was always a sweet girl that got along with everyone and never picked a fight. She was a soft-spoken, enthusiastic sweetheart who didn't have an ounce of hate in her heart for anyone. However, she lived up to her namesake of being a nerd. A majority of her music choices for lap dances on stage consisted of various chiptune music from her favorite Commodore retro video games. Most guests, I think, didn't mind, especially those enthralled with her busty avatar, but the other dancers hated having to float during Nessie's sets because they found her music to be incredibly unsexy and hard to dance to. Though nobody felt they could speak up about it because everyone knew Nessie was one of my friends from long before the club existed. That night at Royals, apparently Luna was standing behind a lap she wanted to float on for the next song, and Nessie, not noticing she had claimed the lap, came up from the front and proceeded to start dancing on them. This made Luna just blow up at her and Izumi backstage, screaming at her. Luna already had a history of being banned from other clubs, so it wasn't much of a loss, but I felt bad for Nessie. Despite falling out of touch with her, I do think she's one of the most wholesome and genuinely kind people in the club scene. And those are just the things that directly involved me or my club. In the broader scene, you would see other things too. Many clubs had rules against bringing drama into events, but that didn't stop certain guests from having a conversation about their recent breakup and how they were going to get back at their ex for it, or rumors of people being pedophiles, etc. The most flirty dancers had the cult followings, as I've said, and wouldn't be above flirting with their simps for things far beyond lap dances. Their simps would buy them just about anything, often with the hopes of the good karma returning to them in the form of sex or a relationship that never materialized. I did hear on occasion the odd dancer or two bragging about how their simps paid for expensive luxury items for them and laugh at how they were exploiting that attraction for goods. And then there were the poachers. These were other club owners that would attend some other club's event, get dances, and try to subtly convince the dancers and other staff to come work at their club instead. This was heavily frowned upon in the scene, but wasn't always punished, whether that be just because the owner wasn't made aware of it, or didn't think it was a big enough deal. There wasn't some one-size-fits-all formula for the drama. Sometimes it was big, other times it was small. Some people involved seemed like they genuinely enjoyed watching others crash and burn. Others seemed like they were oblivious to how their actions were hurting others. The drama taught me that the kindness and maturity I thought I could bring into the club scene was nothing more than a pipe dream. By the time Hellbound was established, I had learned that almost every club maintained some kind of blacklist. In theory, there was nothing unusual about that. If someone repeatedly harassed dancers, disrupted events, threatened staff, ripped avatars, or created a genuine safety risk, clubs needed a way to keep them from returning. Nobody wanted to spend months building a community only to let someone through the door who had already caused problems at several other venues. The question wasn't whether a club had a blacklist, it was whether that list remained an internal security tool or became part of something much larger. Some clubs maintained their own private lists. Others partnered with community-run blacklist organizations that operated independently from any single venue. The arrangement was almost like hiring an outside security company. Clubs would partner with these organizations run by a committee of various other club owners to gain access to a shared database of banned users and submit their own cases for investigation. On paper, the system offered something individual clubs couldn't provide on their own. A troublemaker couldn't simply get banned from one venue, wait a week, and start over somewhere else where nobody knew their history. Reports could be collected across several communities, and security teams had access to information that might otherwise remain isolated inside private Discord servers. That was the sales pitch, anyway. The largest and most well-known of these organizations was called the Red Light District. At Hellbound, we briefly partnered with them, but I soon changed course and shifted to an internal model. The longer I spent around the club scene, the less comfortable I became with the people operating these systems and the culture growing around them. They didn't always feel like administrators quietly reviewing reports because they cared about community safety. Many appeared intensely invested in the investigations themselves. You could hear the excitement in some people's voices when they talked about a new accusation, a possible confession, or another person who might be added to the list. Someone being accused became entertainment for them. People gossiped about who was supposedly a predator, who was an avatar ripper, who was dangerous, and who was currently being investigated, even outside official meetings. Claims spread through overlapping friend groups and club staff before anyone had reached a conclusion. And the difference between a pending allegation and a proven incident could disappear almost immediately. More concerning was the overlap between some blacklist communities and VRChat's gang culture, but we'll get to them in the next section. Not every blacklist administrator was a gang monkey, as they're called. Many of them were just honest club owners trying to keep their community safe. However, in my experience, there was enough overlap that it couldn't be dismissed as an unrelated problem. Some people involved with blacklist communities also associated closely with gang monkeys or drew on those connections when they wanted information, leverage, or a confession from somebody under investigation. That changed the stakes completely. A blacklist by itself could keep someone out of several VR nightclubs. A blacklist backed by people willing to attack people in VRChat could affect their entire life. Someone accused of serious misconduct might not simply receive a Discord message asking for their side of the story. They could be pressured, threatened, repeatedly contacted, and harassed by groups of people who had already decided they were guilty. And all of this could begin before the evidence had been properly evaluated. Investigations were usually handled by club security or by volunteers inside the blacklist organization. Evidence might include screenshots, recordings, chat logs, and witness testimony. The problem was that there was rarely a reliable way to verify the complete context or authenticity of everything submitted. Screenshots could be cropped, messages could be omitted, recordings could begin after an argument had already escalated. It was incredibly easy to take these things at black and white face value, rather than ask the tougher questions that treaded a more morally gray area or required more nuance in reading between the lines, such as in the case of my former friend there, who was blacklisted. Digital evidence could also be fabricated. I only personally encountered one convincing fake screenshot, so I can't say how common the practice was, but seeing it once was enough to understand how vulnerable these systems were. A believable Discord screenshot could dramatically reshape how an entire community viewed someone, even if the conversation had never happened. Despite those weaknesses, the accused were often treated as though the burden was on them to prove their innocence. A security member might technically ask for their side, but the tone would already be accusatory. Confessions were sometimes demanded rather than information requested. If you were accused of being a pedo, there was basically fuck all you could do to prove you weren't, as denying anything only made people more suspicious of you, even if you were telling the truth. As rumors spread, clubs felt pressure to make decisions quickly so they wouldn't be accused of protecting somebody dangerous. Once a name appeared on a prominent blacklist, questioning that decision was discouraged. Other clubs were expected to add the person to their own list whether or not their own owners had reviewed the original evidence. Reconsidering a case could make people suspicious of you as well. The fear wasn't only that a blacklisted person might cause trouble at your event, owners also worried that the rest of the scene would turn against their club for allowing them inside. Being a part of these community blacklists almost became like a blood pact, where if you weren't honoring the pact, your club would almost certainly be marked for death. That gave these organizations an enormous amount of influence. Hellbound eventually left the Red Light District and instead switched to a closed internal list consisting primarily of people who had directly caused problems for our club. Information was only shared when necessary with clubs we were actively collaborating with. We did this because of the culture I mentioned, where if there was an offender at another club, you took their word that not only had the incident actually happened with this person, but due diligence had been done to prove their guilt. There may be associated evidence, but it was always so disorganized to find, and even if you did, who wants to spend an hour going through all of it? I wasn't comfortable just passing judgment on to people I had never met or encountered based on what a spreadsheet said. I would rather have my own evidence than rely on everyone else's. This way, we put the power directly in the hands of our own security team. If we made a mistake and got something wrong with our blacklist and someone was actually innocent, nobody would ever know that they were on our list apart from us and our direct partners. This way, we wouldn't automatically destroy their reputation throughout the entire club scene. That choice created some distrust among other clubs, and I got the sense from a lot of other owners that I was foolish for not staying with a community blacklist. But I was fortunate that it never resulted in a major campaign against Hellbound. Other people weren't always so lucky. Refusing to immediately accept the court of public opinion could be interpreted as protecting a predator, and once that accusation took hold, there was often no coming back for these clubs. There was also no guarantee that the blacklist would genuinely keep dangerous people away. Some returned with alternate accounts, others remained protected because they were close to influential owners or popular members of the scene. A system that could permanently destroy one person's reputation might quietly overlook someone else because the right people like them. In my opinion, for a system focused on justice, it sure seemed incredibly malleable on what justice actually meant. The larger systems became breeding grounds for gossip, pressure, amateur investigations, and accusations capable of changing someone's life. The involvement of gang monkeys made the consequences far more serious than being banned from a virtual strip club. So with all this talk about gang monkeys, who are they, and why are they such a serious thing in the club scene? Well, let's get into that. Up until this part of the video, for the most part, I haven't been holding back. I've addressed direct things I've experienced and named people who I think deserve to be held accountable for the pain that they've caused me. But here, and maybe this will unfortunately stroke their ego a bit too much, I won't be doing the same for gang monkeys. For my safety, the gang monkeys I mention here will either be pseudonyms that I've made up, or be referred to more generically. So, what are gang monkeys? Well, when I was first getting into VRChat, I learned a lot about the game from the YouTuber Fia, who in her VRChat dictionary video described them basically as pranksters, trolls, people who would wear Crasher avatars and crash entire lobbies just to ruin the fun for others. No harm done for the most part, apart from a pinch of annoyance and the time it took to restart your PC. This understanding set me up for a very rude awakening. Gang monkeys are far more dangerous than that, and I think the best way to illustrate that is to take you on the journey through my experiences with them. My first sort of encounter with them happened while I was DJing for Club Lunar one night, and security got on the group VC in a bit of a panic. They informed the owner that a group of roughly half a dozen gang monkeys had shown up in the lobby and were threatening to crash the entire event instance. The owner went to handle it with security and told the host to announce to the guests that they needed to stay inside the club itself for a security reason. Luckily, the world was designed in such a way that the lobby was far enough away where the Crasher Avies didn't really do anything. After a few failed attempts to crash the instance while arguing with security and the owner, all of which was kept quiet from the rest of the staff, they left. I never saw them. After all, I was DJing and couldn't leave my post, but this was my first taste of gang monkey activity in VRChat. Even so, it still largely aligned with what Fia had said in her video. But that changed while I was dating Neko Snowlily. I don't remember all the details, but more or less, it went down like this. While I was helping her launch her club, Nekomata Domain, we had recruited this guy she had met as a DJ. Much like what happened with Temptress and that other dancer, he recently had gone through a messy breakup with someone in the club scene. However, unlike the other dancer, he was honest with us. He laid out the truths of his past and was very forthcoming. While he himself was still a minor, he started dating someone else who was also a minor, but a bit younger than him, and ended up still being a minor when he turned 18. He initially tried keeping the relationship going in more of a platonic version with no sexual or physical aspects while waiting for her to also become of age. But once he was caught with her and started getting harassed for it, he broke off the relationship and admitted he made a mistake. He hadn't talked to her for several months by the time that we had found and recruited him, and he didn't seem to be a creep. He didn't have any other appropriate relationships. We never saw him around minors, talking to minors, or anything of the sort. So, Neko and I both agreed he was a changed man, and brought him on board to her staff. Turns out, one of his accusers was, by happenstance, another member of Neko's club, who I believe was a host. She publicly tolerated his presence, but privately would continue to try to slander his name to others. Fast forward to a couple of months later, Neko was doing a lot of recruiting at various public worlds, as one usually does. And one day, I got home from work and got on VRChat to see her, and she was in one of the private rooms of FBT Haven with a couple of guys who she claimed she had recruited as security. I don't remember their names, and quite frankly, even if I did, I don't think I'd list them here. But these new security guys were not made aware of the discussions about the DJ's past that we had found out prior to their hiring. Not because we intentionally kept it from them, but because it was an executive decision by Neko and I that predated their hiring that we felt they didn't need to be privy to. But I'll never forget what happened next. It was just a couple weeks after that, on New Year's Eve 2024. Neko was hosting a club New Year's party for Nekomata Domain in VRChat's annual New Year's World. I was there, she was there, the DJ was there, as was one of the new security guards. Midway through the event, the host that was one of the DJ's accusers showed up. She pulled aside the new security guard before ever saying hi to Neko or I, someone I think she barely even knew apart from his presence in her club server. Following his conversation with her, he pulled Neko and I aside to talk. In a progressively escalating argument, we tried explaining to him that we didn't feel he was a threat to anyone and we wanted to keep him on the staff. He then said, "Well, I know what I have to do." He ran off and went AFK in the booth behind me, on the ground floor, for upwards of 40 minutes before his avatar disappeared from the world. After the ball dropped, we all went our separate ways and called it a wrap on the event. Just a short time later, as I was getting ready for bed, I got a call from Neko. She was panicking and crying. Since the event's end, a small group of gang monkeys had been targeting her and harassing her, calling her a pedo protector. They sent death and rape threats over DM and doxed her. They sent unsolicited nudes of themselves and threatened to nuke her entire club server if she didn't comply with their demands. Fire the DJ. She barely had time to process what was happening before she saw lights outside. It was the local police, shining lights into her parents' house across the street. She went outside to talk to the cops. They had received a domestic violence call about the property. Clearly a swatting attempt by the gang monkeys, which they also took credit for. She was lucky that they got the address wrong and that they didn't call in a more serious crime. It didn't even wake her parents up. She stayed on the phone with me, completely shaken by the whole ordeal as she talked to the cops. I swear, we ended up staying up till 4 in the morning dealing with it, and the gang monkeys just laughed. Now, I know I've said some things about Neko here myself, and I don't think we made a very healthy couple, but I have never defended what these gang monkeys did to her. It's disgusting and deplorable, and I wouldn't wish that shit on my worst enemy. Turns out, when the newly hired security went AFK, he orchestrated the attack with a couple other gang monkey friends of his, including one I'll call Ghost. Well, wouldn't you know it, Ghost was close friends with Temptress. And this is far from the last time my path will cross with his. I became more familiar with Ghost once I broke up with Neko and started dating Temptress. Well, sort of. I never actually saw him, and we never talked. But Temptress told me a lot about him, and would subtly make me paranoid of him. According to her, she claimed he had a hacked client that could let him appear completely invisible. No avatar, no name tag, not even an interact button. She claimed he would stalk us when I tried to have private time with her, that he would be lurking nearby, watching. How true this was is up for discussion. It could have all just been a lie by Temptress, but she claimed Ghost simped for her and that she had him wrapped around her finger, which afforded me, her boyfriend at the time, a small modicum of protection, even if it didn't feel like that. Temptress herself claimed to be a retired gang monkey, though sometimes I question if she was really in retirement, especially with what happened next. One day, I remember sitting with her in Popcorn Palace, watching something together, cuddled up. A few of her other friends from the club scene showed up and hung out as well. Now, I'm not sure how the topic came up, but we ended up talking about Neko. I didn't really want to get into it, as I didn't want any more hate sent Neko's way, especially after what happened last time, But her friends reassured me it was a safe space. So I told them about her attempt to get me to impregnate her on Valentine's Day. I don't think I'd even told Temptress the story at that point in time, so she heard it all for the first time there as well. They swore nothing would come of it, but they lied. Just a couple of days later, Neko reaches out to me in a state of rage. Her club server was hacked, nuked, and vandalized with the phrase, "Neko is a rapist," all over it. Whoever did it made clear references to the story I had told, and she accused me of orchestrating it, which obviously I didn't. Suspecting Temptress, I immediately confronted her about this, and she swore no involvement, but claimed she knew who did it. She said it was Neko's new boyfriend, Sarge, and sent a screenshot of a Discord conversation where he allegedly orchestrated the hit on Neko's club server. But to me, that made no sense. Neko and Sarge seemed happy together. What motive would he possibly have to do something like this? The higher-ups in my club, including dance captain Izumi Sakura, who was close friends with Neko, closely examined the screenshot, and eventually we realized it was a fake. We still don't know who it was in the actual message that had Sarge's account photoshopped over it, but I highly suspect Temptress was behind it, and that the person she was talking to was Ghost. I can never prove it though, and still today I'll say it's just a theory, but it's a strong theory. There were other incidents too that I overlooked, such as Temptress grilling a Quest user who joined off of one of her friends that she didn't know, threatening to dox him if he didn't identify himself, thinking he was some kind of spy, or her pulling me into a world with another gang monkey who claimed I was an alt account for notorious VRChat predator Tech Gangster. Newsflash, I'm not. I barely even knew who that was at the time, and my social anxiety makes me phobic of public worlds, which I hear Tech Gangster spends a lot of time in, so yeah, not me. I think Temptress did that just for her own amusement, to watch me squirm. There was even an instance where I witnessed my former head of security threatening to unleash the hounds on someone who made Kenzie upset, whatever that meant. I have no proof he was a gang monkey, and I'm not claiming that he was, but he ran in similar circles and certainly had the same skill set for intimidation. Many gang monkeys feel, though, as if they are on the right side of history, because they don't just target random people out of the blue. They go after alleged predators. If no one accuses you of being one, you may never encounter one, and even if you do, it probably leans closer to what Fia described in her video, just the crashers who crash the lobby for fun. But that's a gang monkey on a good day, when he's got nobody in his sights. If that's you, though, they use every illegal method under the sun to make you wish you were dead, regardless of how true or false the claims against you are. There are many different organizations all running off the same playbook, but the most common is the Laughing Coffin. I've heard mixed reports about them. Some people claim they are still very active and very dangerous. Others claim they were disbanded ages ago and that the only people still using the banner today are script kiddies who don't actually know how to hack. Regardless, the gangs were by far the worst aspect I ever faced in the club scene, and nobody prepared me for how bad it really was. After all this talk about blacklists and gang monkeys, you may be asking, why were so many ordinary VRChat players willing to dedicate hundreds of hours of their lives investigating strangers or to go such extreme lengths to torment people just on the suspicion that they might be a predator? I don't think that answer starts with VRChat. I think it starts with the generation that built much of its culture. A large portion of the club scene was made up of Gen Z. These are people who grew up watching institutions they were told to trust repeatedly fail to hold powerful people accountable. Politicians lied, corporations covered things up, influencers got exposed one week and then came back the next. Hell, when your own president is a pedo and is walking away scot-free, kind of makes you question how effective the government is in stopping these people. Public trust in authority was already low before most of these people ever downloaded VRChat. Then they entered a platform where adults and children were sharing many of the same spaces. For years, players complained that VRChat wasn't doing enough to separate these groups. Age verification eventually arrived, but by the time that it did, many people in the club scene had already lost confidence that the platform could effectively solve the problem. Not long afterward, stories began circulating about kids who simply borrowed their gullible parents' ID just to get age verified, reinforcing the belief that determined minors could still gain access to adult spaces even with the badge meant to stop that. Whether every story was true almost became secondary. The trust was already gone. Once people stop believing the people in charge are capable of fixing a problem, they start trying to solve it themselves. Combine that with a very strong moral compass facilitated by the internet's access to varying cultures and personalities, and that's where I think a lot of VRChat's vigilante culture comes from. At its best, it came from people who genuinely wanted to protect others. At its worst, it became a community convinced that protecting people justified almost any method used to do it. These blacklists and gangs would rather accuse 99 innocent people and ruin their lives if it meant catching that one singular predator. Understanding doesn't excuse what some of these groups became, but I do think it's important to understand why they existed in the first place. Most of the people involved didn't wake up one morning wanting to become amateur detectives. Many of them genuinely believed they were filling a void that nobody else was willing or able to fill. Another thing that surprised me in the club scene was how many clubs seemed unbothered by gang monkeys. If someone wasn't actively causing problems, many clubs simply carried on like nothing was wrong. There was an understanding that certain people had reputations, but as long as they weren't disrupting an event or directly threatening the club, they were often left alone. As long as they weren't your problem tonight, you didn't make them your problem. If you only ever attended events, your understanding of these people would probably look a lot like mine did when I first heard the term. You'd think they were just another variety of troll who enjoyed ruining public worlds. From where I stood as an owner, it looked very different. Some club owners, like the former owner of Club Mansion, wasn't a gang monkey themselves, but kept some of them close in their inner circle to use when they needed to. Funny enough, one of them was right under my nose as a fellow staff member. It was Ghost. I believe this was because some owners thought it was safer to keep potentially dangerous people close than to risk becoming their enemy. Whether that was the right decision or not wasn't really my point. It showed me just how seriously some owners viewed the possibility of becoming a target themselves. Looking back, I don't think every owner understood the environment they were operating in. Some seemed completely unfazed by it. Others struck me as people who had started a club because they loved entertaining guests and suddenly found themselves navigating problems they never expected to encounter. I don't think there was one kind of club owner. Some came from difficult backgrounds and didn't seem intimidated by much. Others were simply trying to build a fun community and discovered there were parts of the scene they hadn't known existed. The gangs themselves weren't actually the reason I left the club scene. Ironically, the deepest scars came from people I loved and trusted. My friendships and relationships. The people I willingly let into my life. The gangs mostly taught me something else. VRChat is unique in how conflicts can so easily leave the headset. Sure, you hear about someone getting hunted down in real life because they embarrassed someone in Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto every now and then, but in VRChat, gangs make that their regular MO. But one question remains unanswered. Why here? If these groups were so focused on finding people they believed were dangerous, why do they spend so much of their time around clubs? Well, the answer, at least from everything I heard and experienced, was surprisingly simple. They believed that if there were going to be adults preying on minors anywhere in VRChat, adult clubs would be the most likely place to find them. From their perspective, it made sense. The club scene revolved around adults. It revolved around sexuality. And despite most clubs doing their best to keep minors out, everyone knew there were underage players who wanted to get in. Wanting to protect children is an admirable goal. Nobody reasonably wants predators in any community. The disagreement was never about whether children should be protected. It was about what people believed they were justified in doing to accomplish that. When protecting people becomes more important than verifying the truth, mistakes become much easier to make. When accusations spread faster than evidence can be examined, innocent people can become collateral damage. When social pressure replaces due process, trust falls apart. There are undoubtedly people in VRChat who pose a genuine danger and deserve to be removed from communities. But I also came away believing that a system driven by fear, urgency, and public pressure could easily lose sight of the difference between protecting people and punishing them. If there's one thing I want people to take away from this chapter, it's this. Should you be afraid of gang monkeys and the blacklist culture of VRChat? Yes. Should you let that stop you from making your own clubs? No. You just need to understand the environment you're stepping into. Most people will never encounter this side of VRChat, and I genuinely hope they don't. But if you spend enough time in certain circles, especially behind the scenes of the club world, eventually you'll start seeing things the average guest never does. And once you see them, it's very difficult to look at the community the same way again. By this point, we've talked about clubs, blacklists, gangs, accusations, and all the chaos that seemed to surround the club scene. Looking back, I think almost all of it revolved around one issue, the same issue that all of VRChat revolves around: keeping minors safe. I don't think that's a coincidence. VRChat was always trying to be two things at once. On one hand, it's a free game rated for teenagers. It's available on the Quest, which is one of the cheapest ways to get into VR. And if you're a parent looking to buy your kid a headset, a Quest is a much easier purchase than a full gaming PC, Valve Index, the whole shebang. It's no surprise that Quest users have a reputation for being younger players. On the other hand, VRChat is built almost entirely by adults. The avatars, the worlds, the shaders, the animations, none of that just appears out of thin air. It takes people willing to learn programs like Unity and Blender and spend hundreds or thousands of hours creating things. Naturally, those adults also want to create content that will appeal to fellow adults. Not all of it is sexual, but plenty of it is. That creates a strange ecosystem. Children are drawn to the creativity, while adults are drawn to the freedom. The same platform ends up serving both groups at once, even though their interests couldn't be more different. Throw in the fact that many teenagers desperately want to be treated like adults, and you've created a player base where boundaries are constantly under pressure. I don't blame clubs for wanting to keep minors out. Every club I worked with took that responsibility very seriously. Long before VRChat introduced official age verification, clubs had their own, albeit flawed, systems to try to verify that guests were adults. They weren't perfect, as I said, but they were a genuine effort. However, I think the word pedophile gets thrown around far too casually, not just in VRChat, but across the internet as a whole. Over time, I've watched the label become a catch-all accusation. Is an adult having an ordinary conversation with a younger player? Well, that's a pedophile. If a minor lied about their age and deceived an adult, it doesn't matter how much the child confessed to masterminding it, the adult is obviously a pedophile. I even saw people use the label in situations involving consenting adults simply because they found the age difference uncomfortable. Once that accusation entered the conversation, nuance often disappeared. That's what troubled me the most. Being wrong about an accusation like that can permanently alter someone's life. Now, none of this means that I think genuine predators don't exist in VRChat. They absolutely do. Anyone who knowingly manipulates another person into a sexual relationship, especially a child, deserves to be removed from communities and, where appropriate, reported to the proper authorities. Protecting children should never be controversial. What concerns me is how quickly people become convinced they've identified a monster before they've slowed down long enough to understand the situation. Fear has a way of doing that, and I understand why people seem to think the ends justify the means. I just don't believe it's a healthy way for a community to function. I also think the VRChat devs share some responsibility for putting its community in this position. For years, the platform tried to serve children and adults at the same time. Age verification was a step forward, but I don't think it solved the underlying problem. As long as both groups occupy the same ecosystem, there will always be people trying to cross that boundary from both directions. Personally, I think these groups should be separated much more clearly. Ideally, I think kids need their own game, preferably on Quest standalone. You could have creation tools in-game rather than needing to learn other programs like Unity, and could flat out ban adults and adult content in that game. It gives kids a VRChat light experience and keeps them safer in their own gated communities. Additionally, you could also make VRChat require more barriers to entry, stronger age verification, focusing on PC-only content, rating the game M for mature, and maybe even making VRChat Plus required to play. Little Timmy will have a harder time trying to convince his parents to pay $10 a month for years than he will a one-time purchase of $70. Children deserve places built for them. Adults deserve places built for them. And trying to force both into the same room has created years of conflict that I don't think either side really wanted. Now, if you listen to everything I've talked about so far, you might think this documentary is about clubs, and in many ways it is. But I also think it's about what happens when a community spends years trying to solve a legitimate problem without ever agreeing on the right way to solve it. That's why the issue has become so ugly. Not because protecting children is the wrong goal, but because once fear replaces careful judgment, almost everyone starts believing the ends justify the means. And that's a very dangerous place for any community to end up. After spending this entire video talking about gangs, blacklists, manipulation, and everything else that happened during my time in the club scene, I realize this video has probably sounded a bit like an old man complaining about the kids these days. And maybe there's some truth to that. But before I end this documentary, I think it's only fair that I turn the camera back on myself. As much as I can point to the people who hurt me, I also have to acknowledge that I was uniquely vulnerable to being hurt in the first place. About a year before I attended my first club event, I had joined VRChat with a social anxiety so severe that I'd spend entire nights hiding in the corners of public worlds, too afraid to talk to anyone. Growing up, I never had many friends. I certainly didn't have much experience with online friendships. VRChat blurred that line even further because these weren't just names on a screen anymore. They felt like real people standing in front of me. That immersion was beautiful, and it was also dangerous. Without the usual cues we rely on in face-to-face interactions, I had a much harder time recognizing when someone wasn't being genuine. I assumed that if someone spent time with me, laughed with me, or called me their friend, then they probably meant it. I believed that if I treated people with kindness, they'd treat me with kindness in return. I wasn't looking over my shoulder for hidden motives. I wasn't expecting manipulation. I wasn't expecting someone to weaponize trust against me because, quite frankly, I couldn't imagine wanting to do that to someone else. I thought that as long as I wasn't an asshole, I wouldn't become the target of someone else's hatred or cruelty. I never saw it coming. I hadn't yet learned that there are people who carry so much unhappiness into their own lives that they'll gladly take someone else's trust and crush it simply because they can. I walked into that club environment completely unequipped for what it demanded of me. I was trying to lead people before I really understood people. I also think it's important to remember that my experience isn't the only experience. For every club that collapsed under drama, there are dozens that simply keep going. I'm sure they deal with difficult dancers, relationships, rumors, and maybe even gangs, but the owners are experienced. They're confident. They know how to enforce boundaries, manage personalities, and keep their communities healthy without letting every conflict consume them. Hell, some clubs like Lux Nova are so successful that they get featured at big corporate-sponsored VR events like VRChat every year. I wasn't one of those owners. I was just a guy with a dream. I wanted to build something people could escape to, for a couple hours. I wanted to give back the same sense of confidence and belonging that clubs had given me when I first discovered them. What I didn't have were the social skills or life experience to navigate the politics that came with it. That's a lesson I had to learn the hard way. And despite everything I've said throughout this documentary, I still believe clubs offer something genuinely beautiful. For someone who feels invisible, unattractive, or like they've been beaten down by the world, a dancer can make them feel like the most important person in the room for a few minutes. For dancers, it's often an escape of its own, a chance to become someone else for a little while, to perform, create, and forget about whatever they're carrying in the real world. I remember watching an interview with a dancer who talked about collaborating with a club whose owner, and one of its dancers, used a wheelchair in real life, but was able to dance freely in VR. Moments like that remind me why these communities exist in the first place. At their best, they're about confidence, creativity, performance, and connection, giving people an experience that they couldn't have anywhere else. Getting involved in the club scene is always a risk. I don't think that will ever change. Some people just aren't equipped for that environment. I certainly wasn't, at least not when I first walked into it. But if you have the maturity to navigate the politics, the resilience to handle the setbacks, and the wisdom to know who deserves your trust, you can really make the magic come alive. Clubs aren't inherently good or bad. They're just made of people. And people are capable of creating both the most unforgettable experiences you'll ever have and the deepest scars you'll ever carry. The trick is learning the difference before those scars have to teach you. If you've made it to the end of the video and still want to take on the risk of starting your own VR club, then I'll give you some tips to start you off to be more successful and more safe than I ever was. As enticing as lap dances are, if you can, I'd avoid them. Stick to stage dances. They're less controversial, less appealing to minors who would have otherwise been interested in joining your club, and more focused on the art of dance rather than the raw sexual arousal of a lap dance. Secondly, fill your club staff with as many trusted friends as you possibly can. The less you have to recruit for staff, the less chance you have of accidentally recruiting someone problematic, or worse, a gang monkey. This was a piece of advice I heard early on from other owners that I ignored due to my social anxiety and already low friend pool. Don't do what I did and rely on strangers for the majority of your staff. Guests can always be brought in from your friends' friends or strangers. They're easier to find and deal with. And thirdly, try to push the boundaries into something unique. Still to this day, I look back at Hellbound's immersive world and I'm in awe, despite all the pain it caused. I regret never being able to bring it all to fruition. Maybe someday I'll come back to it, but not for a long while. I don't know if I'll ever come back to the club scene. I've only started recently addressing the trauma this game has caused. But now you hopefully know what to expect when jumping into the darkest community in VRChat, and won't be caught blindsided like I was. Take care, be awesome to each other. Peace out.